The studio lights were blinding, sleek, clinical beams designed to flatter and expose in equal measure. A red tally light blinked on above the center camera, and the countdown began from behind the glass. 5, 4, 3. A hand gesture replaced the final numbers. They were live. It was supposed to be a standard televised interview, albeit one guaranteed to attract millions of viewers. Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, Twitter, and the axis around which both innovation and controversy seemed to orbit, was seated across from a seasoned journalist known more for provocation than dialogue. Julian Trask, a man whose reputation had been built on cornering politicians, CEOs, and celebrities alike with razor-sharp questions, deliberate interruptions, and the smug satisfaction of someone who always believed he was the smartest person in the room. He wore his trademark look, steel-rimmed glasses, suit slightly too tight, expression neutral in a way that always seemed condescending. Elon, by contrast, looked exactly like Elon. Slightly disheveled collar, relaxed shoulders, a glint of mischief in his eyes. There was no cue card in front of him, no talking points prepared. He had declined a pre-interview. He didn't want to know the questions, because he already knew what was coming. The broadcast opened with introductions, the usual pleasantries, a brief montage of Elon's accomplishments, rockets landing vertically, Teslas racing silently down, highways, satellites lighting up the sky. But the smile on Julian's face never reached his eyes. The audience could already sense it. This wasn't going to be a tribute, it was going to be a takedown attempt. Julian leaned forward. "Mr. Musk," he began, voice honeyed with faux respect. "You've been called many things. Visionary, disruptor, genius. But you've also been called reckless, impulsive, and even dangerous. Which version of you is closest to the truth?" Elon tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the simplicity of the trap. "Depends who's paying you to ask," he replied, tone dry but calm. There was a sharp intake of breath from someone off camera. Julian blinked but kept his smile frozen in place. "Let's talk about accountability," he said. "Your critics say you move fast and break things, only the things you're breaking now include labor laws, journalism, and democratic norms. Are you even aware of the damage your unchecked influence has caused?" Elon didn't blink. "I'm very aware of how uncomfortable transparency makes people who've never had to answer for their own influence," he said. "I just happen to do it out loud, in real time, without pretending to be perfect." Julian pressed harder. "Let's take X, as an example. Since your acquisition, misinformation has increased, hate speech has spiked, and major advertisers have pulled out. Some say you've turned it from a global town square into a toxic wasteland. Do you honestly believe that's free speech?" Elon's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not with anger, but with focus. He leaned forward, voice still even. "I believe in a platform where people don't get silenced for asking questions, even if those questions make governments or corporations uncomfortable," he said. "And if free speech makes advertisers nervous, maybe people should be asking why their business models rely on controlling public conversation." Julian raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "So, you're saying corporate responsibility is less important than internet chaos?" "I'm saying," Elon replied, "that when you let corporate responsibility dictate truth, you no longer have journalism. You have branding. And maybe that's why you're sitting there asking me questions instead of asking them to yourself." A silence pulsed through the studio. For a moment, Julian said nothing. He glanced down at his notes, flipped a page, and tried to recalibrate, but the momentum had already begun to shift. Elon didn't speak with polish. He never had. He stumbled over words sometimes, veered off track, trailed into tangents about probability theory or interplanetary life. But beneath the eccentric phrasing was something undeniable. He believed what he was saying. And in an era of scripted everything, that raw honesty was disarming. Julian turned the page again. "You once said the goal of humanity should be to become a multiplanetary species, but with all the chaos here on Earth, doesn't that come across as escapism?" Elon smiled now, genuinely this time. It's not about escaping, he said. It's about expanding. Insurance policy for civilization. You wear a seatbelt not because you expect to crash every day, but because you know one crash can be enough. Earth is our cradle, but cradles break. Why wouldn't we try to grow beyond it? Julian sat back, and for the first time, didn't interrupt. The live feed continued, rolling quietly as the mood in the room began to change. The audience, both in the studio and at home, could sense it. The critic had poked the bear. But the bear didn't roar. He reasoned. He pushed back with facts, examples, and questions that sliced deeper than any of the ones aimed at him, and Elon wasn't finished. Not even close. Elon leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze fixed on Julian Trask with the kind of quiet intensity that doesn't seek to dominate a room, but hold it accountable. He didn't fidget. He didn't search for approval. He simply waited. And that silence, the confident, unnerving silence of a man who's thought several moves ahead, began to spread across the studio like a slow fog. Julian broke first. He adjusted his tie, flicked his eyes toward the control room, then cleared his throat with an audible hum that betrayed his discomfort. The cards he had prepared were slipping, metaphorically and literally. "Let's talk labor," he said, grasping for a steadier footing. "There are reports that Tesla factories have unsafe working conditions, that your employees are overworked, underpaid, and discouraged from unionizing. How do you justify preaching about the future when you're allegedly exploiting the present, Elon?" Didn't blink. "I've walked those factory floors. I've slept on them, literally, for weeks," he said. "When COVID hit, when supply chains collapsed, I didn't zoom into a boardroom. I was with my engineers at 2 a.m. redesigning ventilator systems. I don't ask anyone to work harder than I do." Julian lifted a finger. "That's not an answer." Workers still allege, Elon cut in, not with aggression, but with a precision that felt surgical. "And how many of those allegations come from unions with political incentives? How many are regurgitated by media outlets that never stepped foot in a Tesla gigafactory?" He leaned forward now, voice cooler, sharper. "Have you been to one, Julian?" The journalist opened his mouth, hesitated, then offered a curt, "No." "I thought so." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was devastating. Elon didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The moment had already shifted, the scales beginning to tip. Julian fumbled again. "So, are you saying there's no truth to the labor reports?" "I'm saying truth and narrative aren't the same," Elon replied. "Truth comes from data, from context, from first-hand observation. Narrative comes from cherry-picked incidents, presented to generate outrage." The control room's tension was now palpable. Producers exchanged glances. Camera operators adjusted their focus more out of anxiety than necessity. No one had expected the interview to slip out of Julian's grip so completely, and so quickly. Julian took a sip of water and tried again, this time changing lanes. "Let's go back to your history. You've been accused of benefiting from government subsidies while railing against government inefficiency. Isn't that hypocrisy?" Elon raised an eyebrow. "You mean like the government giving billions to legacy auto manufacturers who still don't make profitable EVs?" he asked. "Or aerospace contractors charging 20 times as much for half? The capability of Falcon 9? Julian opened his mouth, but Elon was already in motion, his voice calm but relentless. "I never said government can't do good. I said bureaucracy kills speed. I said monopolies, whether private or public, breed mediocrity. SpaceX took NASA dollars, yes, but we delivered faster and cheaper than anyone else. Tesla was part of a renewable energy credit system, created by the government to encourage innovation. That's not hypocrisy. That's alignment." Now the energy had fully shifted. The audience, once tense and neutral, had leaned in. They weren't watching an interview anymore. They were watching a chess match, and Elon had just taken the queen. Julian narrowed his eyes. "You say you're trying to save humanity, that you care about the species. But your critics argue you're more interested in colonizing Mars than fixing problems here on Earth. Elon's voice dropped a half step. Not in volume, but in resonance. It was the kind of shift that makes people stop breathing for a second. Why do people assume we can only do one thing? He asked. Why do they pretend progress is a zero-sum game? That building a path to Mars means abandoning Earth? It's the same mentality that said exploring the oceans meant neglecting the land, or building the internet meant ignoring books. He leaned forward again. Mars is not a distraction. It's a continuation. And the people too afraid to look up, to imagine beyond their cubicle. They're the ones trying to drag the rest of us back down. But they forget. Every major leap in history started with someone being mocked for thinking too big. He paused, looked straight into the lens. I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to make sure humanity doesn't go extinct. The air had changed. The interview wasn't Julian's anymore. It belonged to the moment, to the idea that the future couldn't be debated into submission, and Elon Musk wasn't finished. Not even close. Julian Trask leaned back now, the muscles in his jaw tightening just enough to betray the composure he fought to maintain. His practiced confidence, the kind honed over years of skewering business moguls and political titans, had taken several precise hits, and he knew it. Elon Musk hadn't just answered his questions, he had inverted them, exposing assumptions, twisting scrutiny into reflection. And the audience could feel it. Online, the live feed's comment section exploded. Some praising Julian's courage, others reveling in Musk's counterpunches, still others awestruck by the sheer unpredictability of what was unfolding. In that rare space where tension, intellect, and ego collided, something electric was happening. Julian tried to shift the momentum, flipping to a fresh card. You say you're trying to preserve civilization, but let's look at Neuralink. Implanting computer interfaces into human brains. How is that ethical? Where are the boundaries? The oversight? Isn't there a real danger in letting a billionaire experiment on what it means to be human? Elon's expression didn't change. No defensiveness, no irritation, just a long, quiet breath. I didn't create Neuralink to control people, he said slowly. I created it because we're already being controlled by algorithms, dopamine loops, echo chambers, misinformation. We're being rewired by our devices every day and no one's talking about it. Neuralink is an attempt to catch up, to close the bandwidth gap between our thoughts and our tools. Julian fired back. You're not a neuroscientist. I wasn't a rocket scientist either, Elon replied. But I learned. I hired people smarter than me. I listened. I iterated. That's how everything meaningful gets built, not by knowing everything from the start, but by refusing to stop learning. There it was again, that unnerving steadiness. No shouting, no bombast, just cold, stubborn momentum. Julian's voice sharpened. But at what cost? We're not talking about smartphones or cars anymore. We're talking about putting chips into people's skulls. Isn't there a line that even you won't cross? Elon leaned forward, his hands clasped lightly. His next words were measured, not as a defense, but as a challenge. The line isn't chips, he said. The line is choice. Neuralink is voluntary. No one's forced. It's designed to help people with paralysis, blindness, neurological conditions. But the real question, the one you're not asking, is what happens if we don't advance our minds? If AI keeps accelerating and humans stay static? He paused. You're worried about implants. I'm worried about irrelevance. About a world where humans can't compete with the very intelligence they created. If we don't evolve, we get outpaced. And civilizations that get outpaced collapse. The air in the room changed again, not from confrontation this time, but from the weight of that idea. Julian blinked. For a moment, he wasn't the interviewer. He was just a man confronting something larger than himself. But his training kicked in. He straightened, smoothed his notes. Okay, let's come back. Down to earth, literally. He offered a forced smile. Your carbon footprint. You run SpaceX, Tesla, and multiple other ventures that rely on massive industrial output. Private jets, Gigafactories, rocket launches. You've said we need to reduce emissions, yet you're a walking contradiction. A spark of something lit in Elon's eyes. Not irritation, but opportunity. I love that argument, he said, leaning forward again. It's easy, it sounds sharp, but it ignores scale. Julian opened his mouth, but Elon kept going. A single Falcon 9 launch emits less carbon than one commercial airplane crossing the Atlantic. Tesla factories replace millions of gas cars with clean EVs. Starlink reduces the need for ground-based infrastructure that damages ecosystems. I'm not perfect, but the net impact of what we're doing is a net positive. You want math? I've got math. He gestured with his hand, as if painting an invisible chart. Last year alone, Tesla offset nearly 5 million metric tons of CO2. How much did your show offset? Julian froze. That one landed hard. Elon didn't say it smugly. He didn't need to. The numbers had spoken. In the control room, producers were whispering into headsets. The interview had gone well beyond its planned length. Viewership was spiking. Every social media platform was igniting with live clips, hashtags, and reactions. But inside the studio, it had gone quiet again. Julian was staring down at his notes, the usual rhythm of his interrogation lost in the wake of a guest who hadn't come to defend himself, but to dissect the narrative. Elon sat there, still and patient. And when Julian finally looked up, his voice came out lower than before. What do you want people to remember about all of this? About you? Elon didn't hesitate. I don't care if they remember me, he said. I care that they remember what we tried to do. That we tried. That in a world full of comfortable decline, someone was crazy enough to say, let's go further. That when everyone else wanted to optimize their portfolios, we were building the next chapter of the species. The red tally light still glowed. They were live. And Elon Musk had just taken over the broadcast. Julian Trask sat motionless for a moment, not because he had no words, but because he was finally beginning to realize that this wasn't an interview, it was a turning point. The man sitting across from him wasn't just answering questions. He was reframing the lens through which millions of people were seeing the future, and he was doing it live, unfiltered, and without a script. Elon Musk hadn't come to defend himself. He had come to speak through the criticism, not around it. He wasn't trying to win favor with viewers. He wasn't there to salvage reputation. He was doing what he always did, laying down uncomfortable truths like steel rails, expecting the world to catch up when it was ready. Julian turned another page from his diminishing stack of cards, but the movement was slower now, no longer laced with certainty. His hand hovered over the next question, as though even he didn't believe it had the weight it once carried. But he pressed on, as professionals do. You've called legacy media corrupt. You've mocked journalists on Twitter. And now, you own one of the largest public platforms on the internet. Isn't there a conflict of interest there? How do you separate power from truth? Elon's expression shifted just slightly. Less a reaction and more a calibration. There's always been a conflict, he replied evenly. The difference is now it's visible. When traditional media was the gatekeeper, no one questioned how stories were shaped, how headlines were sold. Now people can see the process, messy, chaotic, loud, but more honest. He continued without giving Julian time to redirect. Twitter didn't become chaotic because I bought it. It revealed the chaos that was already there, biases, suppression, manipulations. What I've done is rip off the mask. Now the people choose what's important, not editors, not shareholders. People. Julian's voice was quieter now. But does that include dangerous voices? Free speech, Elon said, is messy. It always has been. But it's a necessary mess. The alternative is curated obedience, and history hasn't been kind to that model. He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes. If you trust people to vote, to marry, to raise children, to fight wars, then you must trust them to speak. Otherwise, what you're endorsing isn't civilization. It's control. The words hung in the air like smoke after gunpowder. Julian tried to counter. But what about misinformation? What about the lies that spread because of free speech? Elon nodded. And what about the lies that spread because of censorship? He tapped the desk lightly, as if drawing the viewer back to their own memory. Weapons of mass destruction, financial crash, food pyramids, sugar, smoking. History isn't short on examples where silencing dissent let harm flourish. The solution to bad speech isn't silence, it's more speech. He paused. Let the ideas fight. Let the people see. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a world view. Julian sat back again, visibly grappling with the weight of the answer. His show had never gone this deep before, never dared to brush this close to philosophical raw nerve. So, he said finally, what do you think your role is in all of this? What are you? Elon laughed, a short, almost surprised sound. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't theatrical. It was human. I'm not a politician. I'm not a messiah. I'm just a guy who asks, why not? More often than most people are comfortable with. Julian raised a brow. That sounds like something someone on a power trip would say. Elon didn't flinch. And yet, most of what I do reduces power. Tesla removes oil dependence. Starlink decentralizes internet access. Twitter gives everyone a mic. Neuralink could eventually free people trapped in their bodies. The only thing I want power over is inertia. Silence again. Not hostile. Not dead. Just staggered. Elon glanced down at his hands, then back at Julian. I've made mistakes, said things that sounded harsh, fired people when it felt necessary. I'm not asking to be worshipped. But if I have to choose between being liked or moving civilization forward, I'll choose the mission. Every time. The red tally light above the camera was still glowing. Live. Still live. And across the world, millions of people were watching, some wide-eyed, some angry, some captivated, all awake. Julian reached for the next card, then paused, staring at it. Finally, he placed it face down. He looked back at Elon, slower this time. Less like a man trying to win, and more like a man who'd just learned something. You said you're not here to be liked, he said. But what if people do start following you, not just your companies, but your way of thinking? What if this goes beyond rockets and cars and tweets? Elon paused, his voice quieter now. Then I hope they remember to think for themselves. Because I don't want followers. I want problem solvers. That's how we earn our future. And in that moment, beyond the lights, beyond the feed, beyond the noise, there was clarity. Because this wasn't just a CEO defending his empire, it was a man trying to make sure the world didn't stop asking what's next. Julian Trask sat, still now, not frozen, not defeated, but transformed into something else. Present. Whatever game he'd come to play was gone. Whatever point he'd intended to prove had dissolved in the force of Elon Musk's unapologetic candor. And in the studio, where light and silence held equal power, something rare had emerged, authenticity. Not performance, not debate, but raw, frictional truth. The control room had stopped whispering. There were no more cues being fed through Julian's earpiece. The segment had gone long, but no one dared cut the feed. The producers knew what they were witnessing wasn't content. It was history. Julian finally broke the pause, this time with a tone unfamiliar to his audience. Sincerity. So you're not afraid of being misunderstood? Elon shook his head slowly. No, he said. I'm afraid of not trying hard enough before it's too late. The words weren't rehearsed. They dropped like a hammer in velvet, soft and crushing. Julian blinked, letting that sit before continuing. Then what does too late look like? Elon exhaled. He stared at the camera for a moment, not as a performer might, but as a man addressing every viewer one by one. Too late, he said, is when the last child breathes polluted air and thinks it's normal. When the last tree is cut down, and people argue about whose fault it was while sitting on plastic chairs. It's when we build so many walls, borders, laws, ideologies, that we can't see the horizon anymore. It's when we've forgotten how to be curious, how to be bold. He paused. Too late is when we stop reaching. Julian swallowed hard, visibly moved. Something in him wanted to pull back, to regain the journalist's armor. but he couldn't. Not here. Not now. The conversation had outgrown its setting. It was no longer an interview between two men. It had become a mirror for anyone watching who had ever dared to dream, failed, and tried again. Elon continued. I didn't start SpaceX because I thought it would make money. I did it because I read too much science fiction as a kid, and one day I realized we weren't going anywhere. We were stagnating. We were waiting for someone else to be brave, and I just got tired of waiting. He looked down briefly, as if searching through a file in his memory, then lifted his eyes again. When I was younger, I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. I didn't fit the rules. I asked questions at the wrong time. I was awkward. But I could see things. Possibilities. Not perfectly, but enough to know we were missing something. So I stopped asking for permission. That line lingered like an anthem. Julian leaned forward slightly, genuinely curious now. And how do you know when to stop? Elon smiled faintly. I don't. That's the problem, and the gift. It was the closest he'd come to vulnerability in the entire broadcast. The admission that even the boldest visionaries carry doubt, that even the architects of tomorrow walk tightropes between genius and collapse. But instead of recoiling, he leaned into it. People think building rockets or cars or neural interfaces is the hard part. It's not, he said. The hard part is believing in something long enough that it survives failure, that it survives mockery, scandal, exhaustion, that it survives you, your flaws, your missteps. And if you're lucky, you live long enough to see it become real. The camera zoomed out slowly. The image of two men at a desk now looked like something else entirely. A blueprint, a confrontation, a confession. Julian, with quiet resolve, said, You've been accused of being arrogant, chaotic, even dangerous. What do you say to those who fear where your influence is taking us? Elon looked straight ahead again. I say I understand. I say I welcome the criticism. But I also say, look at the results. Not the headlines, not the noise. The results. Ask yourself if your children are breathing cleaner air because of electric vehicles. Ask if you can get online in a remote village because of Starlink. Ask if we're closer to being a multiplanetary species now than we were 10 years ago. Leaned closer to the camera. If the answer is yes, then maybe the risk is worth it. No one moved. Not the camera crew, not the producers, not even the studio assistants behind the scenes. Because in that moment, it was undeniable. Elon Musk had shifted the ground beneath the conversation. He had done it without rage, without spectacle, without needing to shout. He had done it by showing up, flawed, driven, and unwilling to stop dreaming just because someone else found it uncomfortable. And whether you loved him or loathed him, whether you saw a genius or a madman, one thing was now impossible to deny. He wasn't building products. He was building paradigms. And the future no longer belonged to those who had the loudest critique. It belonged to those who had the guts to build it anyway. The red live light above the studio camera flickered off. Silence followed. No applause, no dramatic music, just the low hum of equipment, the soft shifting of paper, and the lingering presence of everything that had just unfolded. Julian Trask sat motionless, his fingers resting lightly on the cards he hadn't needed. He looked across at Elon Musk, no longer with the smirk of a critic or the calculation of a showman, but with something simpler. Respect. Not because he'd lost a debate, but because he had witnessed something he couldn't have scripted. A man refusing to dilute the future for the comfort of the present. Elon rose from his chair, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, and for a moment, didn't say anything. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was earned. He looked around the studio, not with pride, but with the gaze of someone already thinking beyond it. About engine designs, about Martian soil chemistry, about orbital debris, about timelines stretching decades forward. One of the producers approached timidly. Mr. Musk, thank you. That was... She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. He just nodded. No problem. He left the studio with no entourage, no security detail, No press handler sweeping through the halls behind him. Just a quiet exit from a room he had filled not with noise but with substance. Backstage, monitors were still replaying moments from the interview, his defense of free speech, his vision for Mars, his refusal to accept too late as a timeline for humanity. The control room remained still. People stood with their arms folded, staring at the playback like they were trying to process what had just happened. No one reached for the stop button. No one dared cut the feed early. Across the world, the internet exploded, not in chaos, but in waves of introspection. Clips were going viral in real time, stitched and subtitled in dozens of languages. Elon's line about believing in something long enough that it survives you had already become a quote plastered across screens, mugs, and thought pieces. But more importantly, people felt it. Not like a celebrity scandal, not like a trending meme. This was something different, something useful. Teachers played the interview in classrooms. Startups shared it in Slack channels. Parents, unsure of what future their children would inherit, watched it late at night and thought, maybe we still have time. At SpaceX, the late shift continued undisturbed. Engineers moved beneath steel skeletons of engines and boosters, calibrating sensors and running heat tests. They hadn't watched the interview yet. They were too busy building the thing Elon had spoken about. What's next? At Tesla's Gigafactory, the robotic arms didn't stop. On the floor, workers joked about the interview between tightening, bolts, and testing cells. They knew the man who'd just shut down a critic live on air wasn't somewhere in a boardroom sipping champagne. He was likely reading telemetry data, sketching a new prototype, tweeting something absurd. And somewhere in the quiet of his office, perhaps at Starbase, perhaps in Austin, perhaps on the road in one of his electric sedans, Elon Musk sat alone. Not because he was isolated, but because isolation is where his thoughts could stretch without constraint. He didn't check the social media praise. He didn't look at trending topics. He had already moved on, mentally, spiritually, to the next unsolved problem, the next system to build, the next wall to crash through. He didn't care that people finally admitted he'd been right about rockets, or electric cars, or infrastructure, or speech, or satellites. He cared whether we would use the tools now that they existed, whether we would lift our eyes and accept the risk of doing something big again. Because Elon Musk had never set out to be understood. He set out to pull the future closer. And for a moment, in a broadcast meant to corner him, he had done just that. Live, raw, unflinching. He hadn't won an argument. He had reminded the world that you don't need to be perfect to be right, that you don't need to be safe to be good, that you don't need permission to begin. And when the story of this age is written, not in newsprint or tweets, but in what we build, that interview won't be remembered as a clash. It will be remembered as the moment a man stared down the voice of doubt and simply kept walking. Because Elon Musk didn't just shut down a critic, he reopened the future.